In the history of every people, there have been individuals whose impact, influence, and personality have set them apart from their contemporaries and earned for them the special consideration of all those intent on understanding the great impersonal forces and the decisive events which shape a country's history. Such a man was Eamon DeValera, a man whose towering presence, like that of O'Connell or Parnell before him, presides over a great part of the story of Ireland in the first half of the 20th century. Sole surviving Commandant of the 1916 Rising, President of the First Dáil, leader of the Republican movement in the Civil War, founder and long-time leader of the most powerful and consistently successful political party ever in Irish history, and indeed one of the most successful in modern Europe, European statesman at the League of Nations in the 1930s and afterwards respected statesman on the world stage, Taoiseach of the state for over 20 years of its first 37 years of existence, and afterwards president for a further 14 years. The name De Valera evokes an immediate and powerful response across the full spectrum of Irish political opinion, from unswerving loyalty and unmeasured devotion on the one hand, to deep-seated bitterness and hostility on the other. Furthermore, to the outside world, the name De Valera was almost synonymous with Ireland throughout the middle decades of this century, if not indeed right up to his death in 1975. Irish sovereignty, the independence of his country, was the governing passion of De Valera's life. In 1885, the very year that the young De Valera sailed with his Uncle Ned into Queenstown Harbour, Ireland had reached a fateful turning point in her political history. The Fenians, though defeated, had reasserted the separatist message and had focused attention again on the Irish nationalist demand for self-government. The Irish Home Rule Party, under the inspired leadership of Charles Stewart Parnell, was poised to score a major victory in the general election, winning 85 out of 103 seats. By the year's end, Gladstone, the great Liberal statesman, had announced his conversion to the cause of Irish Home Rule. In the face of considerable opposition from the Conservative Party, a Home Rule bill was introduced in the House of Commons. Gladstone's Home Rule crusade failed, but the basic question of how much and what form of Home Rule should Ireland enjoy remained the main issue in Irish politics throughout the political life of De Valera. More problematically, from Gladstone's time on, there remained a doubt about whether a Home Rule settlement would apply to the whole of Ireland or to only a part of it. However, for the little boy who first set eyes on Ireland in the Cove of Cork in 1885, all this lay locked in the inscrutable future. Eamon De Valera was born in the New York Nursery and Child's Hospital in Lexington Avenue on the 14th of October, 1882. New York, at the end of the last century, was a bustling, growing, raw city. It was also the haven for hundreds of thousands of emigrants from the old European world. As the son of emigrants, De Valera belonged to a large and growing constituency. His father, Vivian De Valera, son of a Spanish sugar trader, had studied to be a sculptor, but indifferent health led him to teaching music. In September 1881, Vivian married another emigrant, Kate Coll from Knockmore near Bruree, County Limerick, a young girl who had come to America 2 years previously. Their son, born the following year, was baptized in the Church of St. Agnes in New York. He had been registered at birth as George, but was in fact baptized as Edward. This he later translated to the Irish form, Eamon. Vivian De Valera's health deteriorated, and he died in the spring of 1885. Kate decided that her infant son would be better off at home with her people in Limerick, and so young Eamon returned with his uncle Ned Coll to Bruree late in 1885, to the labourer's cottage in which he was to spend his early youth. Those early years in Bruree were crucial to De Valera's psychological development and his own self-perception in later life. They gave him his most effective weapon in rebutting the charge that he wasn't really Irish at all. In a celebrated but frequently misunderstood statement in early 1921, he declared,
"I have been brought up amongst the Irish people. I was reared in a labourer's cottage here in Ireland. I have not lived solely among the intellectuals. The first 15 years of my life that formed my character were lived amongst the people down in Limerick. Therefore, I know what I'm talking about. And whenever I wanted to know what the Irish people wanted, I had only to examine my own heart, and it told me straight off what the Irish people wanted.
De Valera attended Brewery National School. The oddly named national schools of 19th century Ireland taught loyalty and deference to the established political and social order. Distinct Irish nationality was scarcely acknowledged. De Valera was not the best attender, but showed all-round ability. Clearly a boy of promise, he was soon taking the long road to Charleville, where each day, at the age of 12, he walked 7 miles to the Christian Brothers School. After school, he faced another 7-mile walk home. Here again, ability and hard work opened the door to further education. At 15 years of age, he won a scholarship to Blackrock College. Early stirrings of a priestly vocation soon faded. The solid academic progress of De Valera at Blackrock was marked by a special aptitude for mathematics. He was also most successful on the playing fields, especially at rugby. After matriculation, De Valera completed 2 university examinations at the Royal University. The attractive offer of a senior master's job in mathematics at Rockwell College was accepted and was in many ways rewarding. But it contributed to a disappointing pass in De Valera's final degree examination. Anxious to return to Dublin, De Valera now secured a teaching post at Belvedere College. And then in September 1906, he moved to Carysford College, Blackrock, as professor of mathematics. By this time, however, he was becoming more and more involved in the Irish language revival movement, one of the most enduring passions of his life. He joined the Gaelic League in 1908. Among his teachers at the Gaelic League was an attractive young woman, Sinéad Fhlannagáin. The couple were married in January 1910. As with many other young people of that generation, the Gaelic League for De Valera was one element of a ripening national consciousness. On a political level, the emergence of the well-organized and determined Ulster Volunteers, dedicated to resisting any attempts to implement Home Rule in Ulster, led, by example, to the formation of the Irish Volunteers. When the Irish Volunteers were formed in 1913, to ensure that Ireland would secure Home Rule as promised, De Valera joined at once. He took his volunteering seriously and was careful to carry himself in a manner befitting an officer.
I joined the volunteers early in 1914, the Dublin 3rd Battalion of the Volunteers. And the company in which I was, in the weeknights, we attended drill in a hall in York Street. But on the Saturdays, we paraded in a field in Kimmage for battalion drill. And there we met the battalion officers, of course, including Eamon DeValera. He took part in the drilling of the battalion. And we regard him as a rather remote figure. But we remember De Valera always came in uniform, and he came on a bicycle. And we thought he looked rather funny. He was a very tall man riding on a bicycle in the military uniform. And we had the sense of class distinction over these differences, you see.
When the split came in the volunteers in 1914, the great majority, some 170,000, sided with John Redmond, who was advising Irishmen to go wherever the firing lines extended. De Valera sided with the 11,000 minority, who elected not to fight in the Great War then raging in Europe, but to make a stand for Ireland at home. Sworn into the IRB shortly before preparations were completed for the 1916 Easter Rising, De Valera himself commanded the Boland's Mills garrison during the Rising. It was the last garrison to formally surrender. The Rising itself, largely confined to Dublin, was undertaken by a small minority of the Irish Volunteers. led by the dedicated separatists of the IRB, and joined by a small force of James Connolly's socialist Irish Citizen Army. Despite the almost total disruption of their military plans in the days before the rising, the leaders were determined to test the old maxim that England's difficulty was Ireland's opportunity. Whether they ultimately felt that they were involved in a sacrifice to redeem the nation's sense of manhood, an historic act to assert in arms once again Ireland's right to nationhood, or whether they believed that they were lighting the flame of insurrection which would blaze as soon as the country rallied to their support, they were all to share an initial sense of disappointment at the public response to their action. De Valera, in company with all the survivors, felt the initial hostility of the general population towards those who were held responsible for drawing such fire and destruction on the city. After the surrender, De Valera was taken prisoner and sentenced to death, but the sentence was subsequently commuted to penal servitude for life. In prison, De Valera emerged as a leader of considerable personal magnetism and as a major force for unity among the different groups of prisoners. With the general release of prisoners in June 1917, De Valera was adopted as the Sinn Féin candidate in the East Clare by-election. He was supported by many well-known Sinn Féin figures, including Count Plunkett and Arthur Griffith. De Valera won an exciting victory. Following his election as president of the new, reconstructed Sinn Féin and as president of the Irish Volunteers, De Valera, by spring 1918, was clearly the acknowledged head of the separatist movement in Ireland. His arrest in May 1918 did nothing to diminish his stature. In the general election of December 1918, Sinn Féin candidates routed all opponents throughout nationalist Ireland, taking 73 out of the 105 seats. In January 1919, those Sinn Féin deputies still at liberty assembled in the Mansion House, Dublin, and constituted themselves as the first Dáil Éireann. After his dramatic escape from Lincoln Jail, De Valera returned to Dublin and was elected president of Dáil Éireann. An independent Irish republic was proclaimed. The one major cloud on the nationalist horizon, however, was James Craig and his Ulster Unionists. Consistently since 1885, and with increasing vehemence from 1912, the Ulster Unionists had given clear notice, through the ballot box and the threat of force, that they would have no part of a Home Rule Ireland. They stood aloof from Dáil Éireann and refused to have anything to do with it. A more immediate threat to the Dáil, and to its efforts to establish its authority, was the military response of the British government to the attempt by the Republican Dáil to usurp its authority. Republican units in places like Tipperary were anxious to force the conflict of rival authorities to a head. The gloves were off in the struggle between the Crown forces and the Republican army. The Crown forces, augmented by the specially recruited auxiliaries and the notorious Black and Tans, were opposed by the flying columns of local groups of IRA men in a campaign of guerrilla warfare which became increasingly bloody from the spring and early summer of 1920. The struggle to establish the Republic and make its writ run involved financial, diplomatic and political support as well as military force. In June 1919, De Valera travelled to the United States to win support for Dáil Éireann and for the Irish Republic as proclaimed. He was to remain in America until December 1920. The American tour had more than its share of controversy. De Valera voiced his opposition to those clauses in the League of Nations covenants which guaranteed existing British sovereignty in Ireland. He called on Americans not to support entry to the League unless these clauses were amended. De Valera was accused of improperly seeking to interfere in domestic American politics. Again, De Valera in his speeches tried hard to alternatively strike a hard line on Irish independence in order to keep the morale of his supporters from flagging and to conform to his role as President of the Republic, and a conciliatory line aimed at indicating a willingness to negotiate and to seek terms mutually acceptable to the British and to the Irish Republicans. It was a difficult tightrope to walk. Suspicions were voiced that De Valera wouldn't be as firm in confronting the British as some other Republican leaders. especially those who were directing the war effort back in Ireland. The guerrilla war in Ireland was, by late 1920, a most serious and bloody conflict. This was vividly brought home to the people of Dublin when Sean Tracy was shot carrying out a raid in Talbot Street. By mid-1920, the police force, the RIC, was reinforced by the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. At its peak, in late 1921, the combined police establishment was about 15,000, to which must be added between 30,000 and 40,000 soldiers of the Crown. The IRA volunteers never had more than about 5,000 on active service at any one time, and for the most part functioned well below that strength. It never had an adequate supply of arms, but it was a tough guerrilla army. Where it felt it necessary, it was ruthless. Ambushes on police and army, led by such flying columns as Tom Barry's in Cork, were carried out with lethal efficiency. Government detectives were systematically executed by a special squad under the command of Michael Collins. Suspected informers and spies were shown little quarter. Ultimately, of course, the volunteers depended on the civilian population for information, protection, and shelter. For their part, the Crown forces embarked on a campaign of stern repression, intimidation, and destruction. Frequently, the ill-disciplined Black and Tans and auxiliaries required neither cause nor excuse for inflicting terror on civilians. The taking of life, the wanton destruction of property, the arrest, harassment, and interrogation of civilians bred a mixture of fear and anger among the population at large over wide areas of the country. Public figures were intimidated, or worse. The Lord Mayors of Cork and Limerick were among those murdered. The resourcefulness and cunning of the Republican Army and its leaders was impressive, but the sheer weight of military resources lay with the larger Imperial Army.
The British military had got our measure. They were only sending out convoys, you see, in very large numbers. An armour car, 2 big lorries with about 30 men apiece, 3 or 4 Crossley tenders, and maybe a Lancia car at the back, and they'd be spread over 1.5 miles. Now, 1.5 miles, you see, of an ambush scene required at least 100 men to deal with it. And we had nobody could take charge of 100 men in action, and we had no system of communication to enable one section to know what the hell was happening with the other. So we saw that we couldn't attack the convoys anymore.
Though Lloyd George publicly supported the Black and Tans in their fight against the IRA, he was not oblivious to the need for political movement. The Government of Ireland Act 1920 established 2 subordinate parliaments in Ireland, one for the 26 counties and the other for the Ulster Unionists in the 6 northeastern counties. The Northern Ireland Parliament opened in June 1921, and the Ulster Unionists got busy setting up the apparatus of power within the 6 counties. The British government under Lloyd George was under pressure from King George V to do something about the war in his kingdom. Both internationally and within Britain and Ireland, demands for an end to the war were growing. Lloyd George had to do something. Eventually, in July 1921, a truce was arranged, and De Valera travelled to London for talks with Lloyd George. De Valera fully realised, and had given several clear hints in public in the preceding year, that an agreement would involve some compromise on both sides.
Time after time, we have indicated that if England can show any right with which Ireland's right as a nation would clash, we are willing that these be adjusted by negotiations and treaty.
But the meeting with Lloyd George was not a success. The terms eventually offered by the British government, a limited form of dominion status, were not acceptable to De Valera, and he informed Lloyd George that he could not recommend them to his cabinet or to the Dáil. The real possibility of a resumption of the war cast a dark shadow on the discussions. Public excitement was at a high pitch, both among the Irish in London and among those at home who gathered to witness this fateful diplomatic toing and froing. On his return to Ireland, De Valera immediately moved to inform the Dáil of the situation and to take counsel. He had already written to Lloyd George, saying,
"The deep conviction that true friendship with England, which military coercion had frustrated for centuries, can be obtained most readily now through amicable but absolute separation.
The enthusiastic and supportive crowds no doubt encouraged De Valera that the stand he had taken was a popular one. His own statement of resolution was blunt and to the point.
There is an Indian proverb, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. The Irish people are not going to be fooled this time.
Again, the Mansion House was the centre of attention as the Sinn Féin deputies arrived to take counsel on what their future course of action should be. If anything, Republican attitudes were hardening in the Dáil. De Valera's title was now changed from President of Dáil Éireann to President of the Irish Republic. All deputies now took an oath to bear true faith and allegiance to the Irish Republic. For crucial figures of influence like Arthur Griffith and the main architect of the military campaign, Michael Collins, there were few illusions about the difficulties, political as well as military, which would be involved in maintaining this position. The British acceptance of a truce encouraged many people, including Dáil deputies, to believe that London could be moved if the Sinn Féin leaders stood firm. The president of Sinn Féin, De Valera, was known to be resolute in rejection of the British terms. The high optimism of an anxious public that an acceptable settlement could be reached was reinforced by a natural sense of relief at the suspension of hostilities between the Crown forces and the IRA. Political leaders urged caution, but they themselves seemed firm in their resolution and in their hopes of ultimately getting what they wanted. In August 1921, the Dáil unanimously endorsed De Valera's view that the British terms be rejected, and then re-elected him as President of the Irish Republic. The first round of the political negotiations was over. It was clear that if a resolution were to be found, there would have to be concessions. On the British side, Lloyd George was vulnerable within Cabinet and Parliament. On the Irish side, there were some who regarded any concession with suspicion.
I think we thought that the Republic would be achieved without actually that name being given to it. We thought that England would object strongly, of course, as she did, and would try to beat us down. That's natural. But we didn't see how that could be brought about. I think we felt fairly confident that the hostilities would not break out again. But we weren't certain. We weren't certain of that.
Negotiations continued, and in late September it was agreed that Irish delegates be sent to London. De Valera appointed Griffith leader of the delegation, an appointment which caused unease in some quarters.
I know that personally I was disappointed at the selection of Arthur Griffith. We had a great dependence on Michael Collins, but we felt that Arthur Griffith wasn't, well, he wasn't a physical force man. We felt that if there was to be compromise, that would be on his side.
In addition to Griffith, the delegation comprised Robert Barton, Eamon Duggan, Charles Gavin Duffy, and a reluctant and apprehensive Michael Collins. De Valera himself did not go, a decision which aroused some controversy.
He argued that as head of state he should stay out of it and be able to monitor the negotiations from outside. I can see that viewpoint, but on the other hand, I think that in the circumstances he probably should have gone himself. And then, of course, bear in mind this, that at that particular period, Collins would have been regarded as the extremist, as the one who would be most likely to stick out to the bitter end for a republic. Arthur Griffith, no, Arthur Griffith was never regarded as being really a Republican in that sense of the word. Everybody liked him, had tremendous respect for him, but we all knew that he'd been satisfied with something much less than the Republic. Probably, in retrospect, De Valera should have gone with them to London.
Oh, I'm sure that was an error, yes. And I think he really thought so himself. He used to go on arguing about it to the end of his life. And when students used to go to see him, he was very generous in talking to students about the problem. He would never admit it was exactly an error, but he was always ready to argue it at great length. Yes, I would have called that a clear error. Shall we put it this way? It was an error he certainly wouldn't have made in later life. He was a very young man by international standards. Well, he was under 40 at the time, and he'd had no experience of statesmanship at all.
The fateful, exhausting negotiations lasted from the 11th of October to the 6th of December 1921. Eventually, with the threat of a renewal of terrible war as an alternative, the plenipotentiaries signed the Articles of Agreement, or treaty, without referring back to the cabinet in Dublin. The treaty did not offer a republic. The terms, in effect, meant a form of dominion status. Those who favoured acceptance felt passionately that it was the best bargain that could be got at the time, and offered the freedom to achieve freedom. Among many Republicans, there was anger and disappointment. But to Lloyd George and Griffith, an honourable compromise had been reached.
Oh, absolute disappointment. The oath of allegiance and partition, especially those two items. The oath of allegiance was nauseating to us. And then, of course, the partition was, well, looking back on it now, trying to remember what I felt, the cause for which the men of 1916 had died did not seem to have been upheld.
Digital
In the long, emotional and frequently bitter debates on the treaty, De Valera led the opposition. The oath of allegiance emerged as the major bone of contention. The conflict was about the source of political sovereignty in Ireland. De Valera formulated his own compromise scheme, document number 2, in which he sought to make the state a fully sovereign state in all its internal matters, but affiliated to the Commonwealth for purposes of external association. This formula found few backers. The pro-treatyites claimed that it was totally unacceptable to the British, and the die-hard Republicans felt it to be too compromising. The treaty terms were endorsed by Dáil Éireann on the 7th of January 1922 by 64 votes to 57. De Valera immediately resigned as president of the Dáil. Soon the evacuation of the British troops from the 26 counties began. The treaty debate had shown that while both sides rejected the legitimacy or permanence of partition, neither side had any immediate practical proposals for getting rid of it. Hopes may have been harbored in secret, but in public, a commission to decide the precise boundary was the only new development on offer. Even as the British garrison moved out, the anti-treatyites were determined to take the fight to the country. On platforms up and down the country, the case for and against was passionately argued before large crowds. Count Plunkett and De Valera and the anti-treaty forces called for a united front in the Sinn Féin ranks to secure, if possible, better terms. Particularly worrying to De Valera, as to the other political leaders, was the growing evidence that the split on the treaty was bitterly dividing the IRA, leading to the formation of two rival military groups. The treaty supporters, led with force by Collins, argued that the country had had enough of war, that the terms were honourable and left the way open for further advance towards an independent Ireland. As speech followed passionate speech, the rift between the two sides became wider all the time. Rory O'Connor emerged as leader of the militant Republican side. Accusations of incitement to civil war were levelled on both sides. The ghosts of the Republican dead were invoked, and the rhetorical question asked, would they have accepted this treaty? Many of the widows and relatives of those executed in 1916 or during the Tan War were asked to answer that same question on behalf of their own martyred dead. Liam Mellows at the Republican shrine to Wolfe Tone at Bodenstown gave clear notice that the Republicans would not concede without a fight. For Rory O'Connor, a decision was about to be taken that would cost him his life. As the rift spread ominously in the volunteers, the prospect of a civil war became much more immediate and alarming. Two armed camps seemed to be shaping up for confrontation and a trial of strength. While a majority of the headquarters staff supported the treaty, a majority of divisional commandants throughout the country, particularly in the south, were opposed to it. Worst of all, the anti-treatyites in the army, anxious to prevent the disestablishment of the Republic, assembled in convention and effectively repudiated the authority of civilian control over the army of the Republic. The formation of the new Garda Síochána by the pro-treaty executive led to further recrimination. For De Valera, the shift from political to military confrontation signaled a clear diminution in his own role and influence.
There was a convention held in 1922, early in 1922, and that convention saw the treaty as a coercion act, forcing the people back from the Republic into the morass of home rule, and it elected an executive. I was a member of that executive, and I do know that from the moment of the holding of that convention, that neither De Valera nor Carl Brewer were in any way able to influence the IRA and its drift towards the armed conflict that took place with the attack on the Falklands. I never once heard the executive refer to any member of the executive refer to De Valera, although there were endless deputations that went to see Collins.
The IRA blamed De Valera and the politicians for having made all this mess, all the situation, and they took over very much and distanced themselves from De Valera. We hardly ever saw De Valera during that period.
The country was asked to decide the issue in a general election. Attempts to prevent an open split in the Sinn Féin ranks founded on suspicion, misunderstanding and deceit. The result of the general election of June 1922 was a success for Michael Collins. A decisive majority was returned in favour of the treaty, 58 pro-treaty deputies with 36 anti-treatyites and 34 others. Key figures in the Republican Army, such as Richard Mulcahy and Collins, were now faced with the job of establishing a new state. Most of them did not want to have to fight their former comrades in arms who were now opposing the treaty, but events often have a momentum of their own. Moreover, the British were impatiently pressing for the full implementation of the treaty terms. For their part, the Republican forces were not going to accept the treaty under any circumstances. Where their strength permitted, they had taken possession of military barracks from the departing British. On the 14th of April 1922, they had taken possession of the forecourts in Dublin. For Collins, with his unique prestige among the military men, it presented a harrowing problem. Eventually, under strong pressure from the British government, and in the conviction that the time had come to assert the authority of the government of the new Irish Free State, the government forces began to move against the anti-treaty Republican Army. The civil war, which nobody professed to want, had begun. It was to be a bitter war, setting brother against brother, neighbour against neighbour, Irishman against Irishman. While the Free State troops were better armed from the outset, they were initially outnumbered by the anti-treaty forces. However, a rapid recruitment campaign soon gave the government forces numerical superiority. Physical destruction in the capital was immense. For the second time in a decade, Dubliners saw large areas of the city centre laid waste by artillery fire and arson. The shootouts and deaths on city streets became sickeningly familiar in an atmosphere crackling with violence. The civilian population soon felt the consequences of war. Searches for arms became common. These were not simply precautionary. By special emergency powers given to the army in October 1922, the death penalty could be inflicted for unauthorized possession of arms. Commercial and business life was gravely disrupted. This would have been economically worrying at any time, but with the Irish economy already gripped in crisis and the price slump of the post-war depression, the economic impact of civil war was particularly destructive. A city dotted with ruins. A war which claimed between 600 and 700 dead before its weary end. Outside the capital, the war was heaviest and most bitter in the south and west. These were the areas where the Republican forces were strongest at the outset of the war. Gradually, however, the better armed and in due course more numerous government forces closed in on the heaviest concentrations of Republican forces south of the Waterford-Limerick line and in parts of the west. As the government forces gained control of Limerick City and later of Waterford, the way was open for a drive against the Republicans in Tipperary and the tightening of the net on the Republican strongholds of Cork and Kerry. Here, especially in the later stages of the war, the brutality, atrocities, and destruction were particularly marked. Everywhere the air was poisoned by rancor and civil strife. The physical destruction in town and country reflected the deep psychological scars inflicted on social life. Throughout the Civil War, the military men were in effective control. The essentially political figures, like De Valera, were temporarily eclipsed.
They distrusted him. He was at the first executive meeting in the Nair Valley, but he wasn't allowed to speak. His attitude was quite plainly, at that time, to my mind, that the war should be stopped, that it was utterly hopeless, it was only wasting time, money, and blood.
The voice of political dialogue was drowned out by the rattle of gunfire. De Valera, though titular head of the anti-treaty camp, had little effective control of the military struggle.
It was only when the IRA was in considerable disarray and the people were very confused that IRA officers asked De Valera to form a government to serve as a focus for the country people especially. And De Valera himself told me in a train journey once that we had together that he had considerable hesitation about accepting it. He had no responsibility for the chaos that had been created, and but he felt it his duty to form the government. And it was then that the flood of abuse from press, pulpit and platform poured down on him.
The Civil War was, from an early stage, an unequal struggle. The superior forces and equipment of the Free State government inexorably gained the upper hand on the Republican Army. A war-weary public, whatever its political preferences, had little stomach for any new war, least of all a civil war. From different standpoints, church leaders and those prominent in commercial life supported the government and urged a return to normal life. But before the gunfire was stilled, there were many notable casualties on both sides, former comrades in arms in the War of Independence, now implacably locked in fratricidal strife. Among the Republican dead were numbered Cathal Brugha, Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, Noel Lamass, Harry Boland, Liam Lynch, and Erskine Childers. On August the 12th, Arthur Griffith died, and 10 days later, Michael Collins was killed in an ambush at Bailnamlaw in West Cork. His death at the early age of 31 was a tragic loss to the new state. The war dragged on to its bitter end. in May 1923, the IRA was given the order to dump arms. Despite the end of armed conflict, thousands of Republican prisoners were still held, and the government did not desist from making further raids and arrests. On the 15th of August 1923, De Valera re-emerged onto a public platform for the first time since June 1922. He was addressing an election meeting in Ennis. The Free State forces disrupted the meeting and arrested De Valera. The anti-treaty forces had regrouped to renew the political struggle for the Republic. They were to fight the turbulent 1923 election under the Sinn Féin banner. The new government, led by W.T. Cosgrave, sought a mandate from the people for the work of state building on which they were embarked and for the new constitution which they had just adopted. In the election, the Sinn Féin group, despite a declared policy of abstention and the demoralization caused by the Civil War, gained a creditable 44 seats. Pro-treaty candidates from 3 parties, W.T. Cosgrave's newly styled Commonwealth Party, the Labour Party and the Farmers' Party, won 92 out of the 159 seats. De Valera reflected on the results in Arbor Hill Jail, where he was to remain until the 16th of July 1924. It was a time for taking stock. The outlook was not very bright. He didn't know whether or not he was going to be put on trial, or how long he was likely to be kept in prison. He had a wife and 7 children, and was anxious for their welfare. On the political front, the Republican forces had been militarily defeated. The new state was an established fact. The clock could not be turned back. The Free State government of W.T. Cosgrave was clearly in effective control throughout the country. It was growing in confidence as it came to grips with the complex task of running a new state. Whatever hopes may have been held for future constitutional progress, for the moment, the majority clearly accepted the legitimacy and the authority of the government and of its right to enforce law and order. Kevin O'Higgins and other Commonwealth ministers played an active role in imperial affairs. They certainly seemed to accept Irish membership in the British Commonwealth as something worthwhile. They worked towards increasing the degree of constitutional freedom enjoyed by the Dominions. But this was not always recognised in Ireland. This led to doubts about the character of the state and the direction in which it was moving. The effective powers of the state did in fact increase during the 20s, but there was little sign that the government had any intention of moving towards a republic. The ministers seemed firmly wedded to the terms of the treaty. There was growing unease, even within elements in the army, that the government was dragging its feet on constitutional change, that the treaty, Collins's stepping stone to freedom, was looking more and more like a millstone around the neck of the government.
I doubt if the people generally realised the extent to which they were extending the actual degree of freedom or autonomy or sovereignty which had been secured by the treaty during that period of 10 years, from 22 to 32. They did seem to become identified in the public mind as the pro-Commonwealth Party. But it's also true that they accepted the fact that the state was based on the treaty, that this treaty contained certain safeguards for the state which was so founded, from encroachment on its powers and privileges by the British, and that it was necessary for them to adhere to the treaty in order to ensure that the British would do so also.
British perceptions of Irish political styles confirmed this view.
The worry was that the Irish would force the pace. And this was certainly so in the 30s, which is why there were all the arguments with De Valera and so on. But in the 20s, on the whole, they were reasonably cooperative. There were some matters on which perhaps some people thought they were pushing a bit hard. But it really resulted in general agreement. And I would have thought by 1931 we had a very good understanding in the Commonwealth of how we wanted the relationship to proceed.
Cordial relations between Dublin and London and the Cosgrave government's growing confidence in its ability to run the state made little difference to one major problem, one continuing bone of contention in Anglo-Irish relations: partition. The collapse of the Boundary Commission in 1925 was followed by an agreement between Dublin and London to leave things as they were in respect of the border, now a very real dividing line in the country. The abstentionist Republicans led by De Valera protested, but were frustrated and powerless to influence developments. The abstentionist policy came under increased criticism as a political cul-de-sac.
By 1926, it was clear that the people of Ireland were not going to go back to 1921, and that a new approach, new political approach, was urgent. And overhanging that was the lack of employment amongst our IRA people, and also the fact that the political situation in the country was deplorable.
De Valera, anxious to launch a new political initiative, decided that if the oath of allegiance could be got rid of, then it became a question not of principle, but of policy, whether or not Republican representatives should attend the Dáil. By a small majority, the Sinn Féin Ordesh rejected this view, and in May 1926, De Valera founded his new party, Fianna Fáil. Removing the oath was a priority with the new party, but the problem was how to do it from outside the Dáil. The government blocked every attempt by Fianna Fáil to engineer the abolition of the oath. The murder of Kevin O'Higgins in July 1927 led to the introduction of special powers, including the regulation that in future all candidates for election would have to signify in advance their willingness to take the oath if elected. All other avenues being now closed, Fianna Fáil decided to enter the Dáil. With a last defiant gesture, the oath was dismissed as an empty formula, its solemn force rejected. A major turning point had been reached. Despite the taunts of political opponents and of those Republicans who still adhered to the abstentionist policy, there was to be no going back on this decision. By August 1927, Fianna Fáil were in the Dáil. Eamon DeValera had achieved his ambition. He had brought his party into the parliament established by the treaty he had rejected. Now, from inside the parliament, he could work towards dismantling the aspects of the treaty he found offensive. Within 5 years, those who had come in from the cold were to defeat the Commandant government and to take over the reins of power in the Free State. For De Valera, the journey to power was completed, but his task had just begun.